In the wake of the crash, President Herbert Hoover sprang into action. Hoover feared that if the American people lost confidence in business, the state of the economy would continue to worsen. Hoover began by lowering income taxes, hoping that if citizens spent less on their earnings and taxes, they might be more inclined to invest in the stock market or purchase products. Since income taxes were already low, the new cut gave the public very little extra spending money, and little positive effect was demonstrated in the economy. Hoover was also concerned that the result of the financial panic would mean that businessmen would cut employee wages in an effort to cut costs. Hoover knew that this would have a negative effect on the economy, so he staged a series of meetings with the top business executives in the nation. Hoover requested that workers' wages stay exactly the same. For the most part, the executives agreed, and they pledged not to lower workers' wages. One businessman went a step further to increase the confidence of the American people. Henry Ford made millions in the 1920s by the mass production of the Model T. After the crash, Ford promised not only to maintain wages, but also increase wages for his assembly line workers from $6 to $7 a day. Ford was able to do this by leveling, and in some cases, decreasing wages for the employees who earned higher salaries. But even Ford's attempts did little to change the declining level of confidence that was plaguing the American people. One of the reasons for this was a change in the news media. In the 20s, newspapers focused on the booming stock market and the achievements of heroes like Charles Lindbergh. After the crash, an increasing number of news stories focused on the corruption in big business, hardships in everyday life, and the allegedly increased suicide rates among those who faced financial ruin. Even though the crash affected relatively few Americans in the months that immediately followed, the level of anxiety about the crash, as fueled by the dire stories in newspapers, caused many to spend less money and conserve as much as possible. Lower-income Americans often bought large items on installment plans before the crash, but in the aftermath, they saved what wages they earned, as the threat of layoffs loomed larger. The wealthier class often had the most invested, and therefore had the most to lose when Black Tuesday came. As their extra income evaporated, they too stopped investing and severely limited the amount of money they spent. Small business owners suffered greatly as a result. As merchandise languished away in storefront windows and profits continued to diminish. Banks were also hard hit by the crash. Well over 1,000 banks closed in 1930 alone. The next year, that number nearly doubled. Most of these banks had been speculating in the stock market with their customers' money. As an increasing number of banks closed their doors, more and more Americans saw their life savings vanish. Despite the efforts made by President Hoover to reassure the American people, public confidence in the state of the economy worsened. In previous decades, economic downturns had been referred to as panics. The president felt that panic was too harsh a word and sought another word that would decrease the level of anxiety in the public. Hoover termed this latest slump a depression, and the name took. Hoover maintained his view that the federal government should not interfere with free enterprise. He felt that federal regulation would undermine the capitalist system upon which the American economy was structured. He believed that encouraging industry was an important step toward ending the Depression. If industry grew, more jobs would become available, and people would be able to spend more money. He was strictly opposed to any form of welfare program, thinking that giving money directly to the unemployed would strip them of their initiative and worsen the Depression. Hoover sought to protect American businessmen and farmers from foreign competition. The result was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. The act was passed in 1930, and it raised tariffs on many goods by as much as 60%. The result of the new tariffs was anything but positive. World trade declined, and other countries raised their tariffs to counter the exorbitant American rates. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was supposed to protect the American economy, but instead it helped deepen the devastation and lengthen the course of the Great Depression. As the hard times continued to get worse, even Americans who'd never invested in the stock market began to feel the pinch. In March of 1930, there were between 3 and 4 million people out of work. That number doubled by the following year, and by 1933, roughly 1/4 of the nation's population was overcrowding unemployment offices throughout the country. Many people took to selling apples on the street corners in major cities in order to support their families. Since few people had any extra money to spend, some store owners accepted other items as fair trade for food and other goods. As bad as things were in the cities, things were much worse in America's farmlands.